Yes. So again, it's a Bloomian construct that understand is a cognitive skill, and I want to move away from that. It is incorrect. But speaking of which, um, we know that Bloom's has been around for a long time and has done a lot of service in foregrounding concepts in thinking. And the words there are very good words to understand. But I do want to suggest to you now that the notion of using Bloom's taxonomy is doing much more harm than good, because it is incorrect. You cannot represent the cognitions in a hierarchy like that. It just doesn't work. Now, that can be a bit of a contentious statement. It usually is when I say it. But I have said this to many learning designers and many colleagues through education, and I think it becomes self-evident after a while. But you don't have to take my word for it, because you can take Bloom's word for it, because that's what Bloom said. And Robert Mazzano, in his new taxonomy of educational objectives, which is not a taxonomy of cognitions, more about information processing, but he makes these points here. He says in this book, in the new taxonomy, the problem with Bloom's taxonomy were indirectly acknowledged by its authors, Bloom et al. And you can see in green there, as they say, it's probably more defensible educationally to consider analysis as an aid to fuller comprehension, understanding, if you will, or as a prelude to evaluation. So analysis might begin. You might think categorize is a low-level skill, but you have to analyze before you can categorize. And every time you think something is higher or lower, you can find a counterexample of this, even with evaluation in the red there, although it's placed last in the cognitive domain because it's regarding as requiring to some extent all the others, which is wrong. It's not necessarily the last step in thinking or problem solving, and it could be the first step when you evaluate something that's not working. But the real kick is in the last sentence. In summary, the hierarchical structure of Bloom's taxonomy simply did not hold together well from logical or empirical perspective, so we have to get rid of it because it doesn't work. And that doesn't mean to say we get rid of the words, but it's not a hierarchy. I mean, that's the research is just very, very clear. And we have just been hearing about the value of research-driven practice. So we have to move away from Bloom's as well. There's two significant problems that I think if we don't do this. The first is this notion that higher order skills, so-called, are constituted by lower order skills. So to evaluate is to remember, understand, apply, analyze, and I've even heard people say in that order, and that's just ridiculous. And they're not so structured. There is a way, I think there is that notion of higher order skills as sort of metacognitive working. So there's a different sense in which the word higher order skills thinking works, but not this one. But another one I think is perhaps more troublesome is when we use higher order skills as discriminators between grade levels. So when we say that the A student will evaluate, but the B student simply analyzes. Well, to which I would reply, what did you ask them to do? Because it certainly wasn't analyze or evaluate, was it? Because if you did, that would be the criteria, and then you would judge how well they analyze and how well they evaluate, rather than things. Anyway, I'm just touching on these ideas. I can give you lots of examples where we look at criteria sheets and so things where trying to align this with the task, it just doesn't work. Trying to use the cognitive skills as discriminators is a Bloomian construct, where it suggests that to evaluate is always a higher order skill than an analyze, and that's just not true. And in fact, I was working once with a learning designer, and we had a course we'd developed, and we had understand as one of the objectives. I said, well, you can't have that because it's the lower order objective. And it just boggles my mind when understanding became a lower order skill. Surely this is one of the most sophisticated things we can ask of students sometimes, is to develop a sophisticated understanding. So it doesn't work. So what do we do in the meantime? Well,